My realist framework focuses on states and argues that states are the principal actors in the system. And there's no question that states can get together and they can form institutions like the European Union or NATO. And those institutions are very important for their foreign policy. And if you look at Europe today, you have a set of institutions, and here we're talking mainly about the EU and NATO, which are probably two of the most successful institutions in the history of the world. So what's happened is that all of these European states have come together and they act in concert to some extent, or maybe we could say to a large extent, in terms of formulating a collective foreign policy. But the key point to always keep in mind is that collective European foreign policy is driven in large part by Europe's relationship with the United States. And basically, Europeans have accepted a world in which the United States provides security for European states. And in return, the Europeans basically do what the United States wants them to do in the realm of foreign policy. So when you talk about this concept of Europe, right, it's very important to understand that Europe does not have an independent foreign policy. Some of that is due to the fact that Europe is comprised of independent states. But more importantly, Europe does not have an independent foreign policy because it is beholden to the United States. The United States provides security for Europe, mainly through NATO. And the quid pro quo is that the Europeans do what the Americans want them to do. And in my opinion, this is ultimately not a very healthy situation.
No, so ideally, Europe starts forming their own foreign policy. But even without the US, could you argue that it makes sense for the European Union to expand towards Georgia, Ukraine, etc., because that's in line with offensive realism, where they want to expand and become a more dominant regional hegemon?
No, I don't think so. I don't think Europe could ever become a regional hegemon, certainly without the United States. The United States is, in very important ways, the glue that holds Europe together. Most people don't understand this. But if you took away the United States from Europe, let's say we put an end to NATO, there's no more NATO, no more American military commitment to Europe. The Europeans would be on their own. Countries like Germany would have to provide security for themselves because the United States would not be there with its security umbrella over Germany. And if Germany was providing security for itself, this would not make the Netherlands very happy. It would not make France or Poland very happy. So it would not be a good situation. And this, of course, is why European countries like the idea of having the United States in Europe. It's why European states love NATO, because the American security umbrella prevents European countries from competing with each other for security. And they can instead focus on getting rich because the Americans are providing security. But the problem is, as I said before, is that you Europeans become beholden to the United States, and you have to do things that the Americans want you to do. And by the way, NATO expansion into Ukraine is a perfect example of this. When that decision was made in April 2008, both Angela Merkel and Sarkozy, who was the French president at the time, were opposed to NATO expansion into Ukraine. They believed that it would lead to disaster. Of course, they were correct. But the Americans insisted on NATO expansion into Ukraine. The Europeans caved in, as almost always happens. And the end result is we have this disaster today. So if the Europeans collectively had been more powerful and had been able to stand up to the Americans and say expansion of NATO into Ukraine is a fundamentally bad idea, Europe would not be in all the trouble that it's in today.
But it's a huge dilemma. Then on the one hand, you need the US to basically be the great pacifier in this region and make sure that we're not going to fight amongst ourselves. They provide the security blanket, but at the same time, their policies are not always in line with our what should be our own ideal policy. So, are you saying then we should try to slowly but surely be strong enough to have and formulate our own foreign policy? But that means we would need to unite even more, and there's just so much differences within Europe, culturally, linguistically, economically. Is it even possible to become this strong, united Europe at all?
I agree completely with what you say. As I alluded to before, if the Europeans push the Americans away and try to develop, let's call it a European foreign policy, what will happen is that Europe will fracture and you'll get each state formulating its own foreign policy. You won't have a European foreign policy. So the Europeans are in this terrible situation where they have to basically follow the dictates of the United States to keep the Americans in Europe.
But it means basically, like if you look at the Ukraine, if that escalates further, then it could be devastating for the continent. So it's a dilemma. What's then the ideal solution here? Stay in NATO, keep on following the US, or in the end try to break away from the US and NATO?
There's no good solution. I do not believe it's in Europe's interest to break away from the United States. I believe that the European countries have a deep-seated interest in keeping the American security umbrella over their heads. But at the same time, I think the Europeans should go to greater lengths to push back when the Americans have what I would call strategically foolish ideas. I think it would have made a lot of sense if the French and the Germans and other European countries had pushed back on NATO expansion and had gone to greater lengths to get the Americans to settle the Ukraine war much earlier. After it started. But the Europeans didn't push back. The Europeans followed the Americans. They followed the Pied Piper. And the end result is that the Russians are going to win in Ukraine, and this is going to have really negative consequences for NATO and for Europe more generally.
What kind of consequences?
Well, the fact is that NATO has put its reputation on the line. And if the Russians win and Ukraine loses, this is going to be a devastating defeat for NATO, and it's going to weaken the alliance. And you want to remember, as we've talked about a little bit earlier, there are important disputes and fracture lines inside of Europe. The French and the Germans, for example, are very angry with each other today because of Macron's talk about putting French troops in Ukraine. The Germans were outraged by his pronouncement. And you have all sorts of cleavages in Europe. Hungary is another example. Viktor Orban talks in ways that make many other European countries very angry. He, of course, is angry at those countries. So there are all these cleavages in Europe that are right below the surface. And if NATO were to suffer a humiliating defeat in Ukraine, these cleavages would be exacerbated. And furthermore, Europeans would begin to question the transatlantic relationship. They'd be questioning America's judgment, America's ability to protect them more and more. And this would not be a good thing. So I think there'll be significant negative consequences once it becomes clear that Ukraine has been a failure, which it has been.
And could one of those negative consequences be that Russia smells the West is weak and he would continue invading other countries? Because I listened to Mike Johnson earlier today, the Speaker of the House in the US, who said that we really need to support Ukraine more because he has intel, or his agencies say that Putin would definitely continue attack Poland, attack the Baltics. I also hear that constantly in the Dutch media that there's intel available saying that Russia would make those next moves. Could that be one of the consequences?
No, this is a myth that's been created in the West to generate support for continuing to aid Ukraine. The fact is, in the United States, and even in Europe, but especially in the United States, a lot of people have come to the conclusion that supporting Ukraine in this war is pointless, if not counterproductive. And the Biden administration is having a huge problem getting this aid for Ukraine through Congress. So what the United States and its European allies, and of course this includes the Netherlands, is doing is engaging in threat inflation. And they're making an argument that the Russians are the second coming of the Soviet Union or the second coming of Nazi Germany. And if we don't stop them in Ukraine, they're pretty soon going to be conquering all of Eastern Europe. Then they'll conquer Central and Western Europe. And before you know it, they'll be on the beaches at Dunkirk. And this will be the end of the world. This is nonsense. The Russians don't have the military capability or the interest in even conquering all of Ukraine. It's just very important to understand that. People talk about the Russians conquering countries beyond Ukraine. There's no evidence that the Russians are interested in conquering all of Ukraine. And when people talk about secret intelligence, I've been in this business long enough to know that if there were intelligence that showed the Russians were interested in conquering countries in Eastern Europe or in Western Europe, real intelligence, that it would have been leaked by now. It hasn't been leaked by now, and we don't see any evidence of it because it doesn't exist. This is good old threat inflation.
It sounds a bit like the weapons of mass destruction that were supposedly in Iraq.
Exactly.
But then, if according to your framework, Russia would like to grow its hegemon status in this area, in this region of the world. So maybe a small attack into the Baltics, or trying to form a land bridge between Russia, Belarus, and Lithuania and Kaliningrad would fall within your theory, then, right?
No, because Russia is not powerful enough to become a hegemon. Look, every country in an ideal world would like to be a hegemon. Every country would like to be in a situation similar to the one that the United States is in the Western Hemisphere. The United States is a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. We are so powerful that no country in the Western Hemisphere would ever think about attacking us. That's the ideal situation. The Netherlands wishes it could be in that position. Poland wishes it could be in that position. And I believe Russia wishes it could be in that position. But none of those states have the capability to be a regional hegemon. So Russia is not going to try to conquer territory in Europe to become a regional hegemon because it doesn't have the capability. Now, you talk about the possibility it may attack a country in, let's say, a small country in Eastern Europe, one of the Baltic states. The problem here is the Baltic states are in NATO. And if the Russians attack a Baltic state, be it Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia, they're attacking a state in NATO. These states have an Article 5 guarantee, and the Russians will end up, in all likelihood, in a war with the United States and more generally with NATO. This would be remarkably foolish. This is why the Russians have never shown any interest in trying to conquer a Baltic state. The Russians have been primarily interested in one thing, making sure that Ukraine does not become part of NATO. They're not interested in conquering countries in Eastern Europe. They have been there, they have done that, and it did not work out very well. The Russians, after 1989, were very happy to get out of Eastern Europe. Occupying and managing Eastern Europe was a nightmare. They had to invade Hungary in 1956. They had to invade Czechoslovakia in 1968. They had to put down an insurrection in East Germany in 1953. They had to deal with countries like Romania and Albania that gave them constant headaches. The Russians understand that occupying people who don't want you to run their politics is going to lead to insurrection. It's going to lead to trouble. It's more trouble than it's worth. The Russians have no interest, in my opinion, in conquering other countries.
And in 1993 already, you said that Ukraine should not give up their nuclear weapons because having nukes is, of course, the best deterrent you can have. Would you say the Netherlands, for example, should also have their own nuclear capability? Because we live in such an uncertain time where we can question maybe NATO's future. We can question the future of the continent. Would Holland be strategically smart if we would also acquire our own nuclear capabilities?
No. And you want to ask yourself two questions when you think about this issue. First of all, what's the threat to the Netherlands that would justify getting nuclear weapons? And number two, how would the United States react? Because we all know the United States is deeply opposed to nuclear proliferation. There's no serious threat to the Netherlands. The only real threat to the Netherlands is the foolish foreign policy that the Netherlands pursues. And this is in large part because the Netherlands is part of the EU and it's part of NATO. And the Netherlands has joined onto this crusade where we're pushing both NATO and the EU eastward, especially into Ukraine, and threatening the Russians. The Netherlands got themselves in trouble with the Russians by following the Pied Piper, also known as the United States. But the idea that Russia is a direct threat to the Netherlands and that having nuclear weapons would be good for the Netherlands, I don't think that's true at all. And then my second point is the United States would go to enormous lengths to punish the Netherlands if it tried to acquire nuclear weapons. So there is no good reason for the Netherlands to go down the nuclear road, in my opinion.
Clear answer. Okay. What about the future of the European Union? Do you believe it makes sense to keep on expanding, or because I start to form this belief that it makes more sense to break it up in smaller unions that have more in common culturally, linguistically, economically. For example, you could have a Latin union, a Slavic union, Nordic union, maybe German-Dutch union. Because now it becomes this Tower of Babel where the interests are so not aligned, yet they keep on expanding. I think at some point until they reach a breaking point. But what's your view on the European Union and its viability, its future?
Well, I think, first of all, the European Union should stop expanding and should definitely not expand into places like Ukraine and Belarus. Second point I would make is that I think the European Union's future depends in large part on what happens to NATO. Most people in Europe don't realize this, but the reason the European has been so successful is because of NATO. NATO provides security. It in effect takes the security issue off the table, and it allows the European Union to operate in ways where the states in the EU can maximize their prosperity. It's what we were talking at the very beginning of our conversation about, right? There's a security logic and an economic logic, and the security logic is taken care of by NATO. NATO provides security for Europe. It takes security issues basically off the table.
Until it doesn't, right?
Pardon?
Until it doesn't. Let's say Trump gets the presidency again, and he already said, "Yeah, well, let's first see if every NATO nation will pay up and make sure to invest enough. Otherwise, they can mind their own business." But sorry, you can continue. But I feel like maybe we were depending a bit too much on the security blanket, and now when push comes to shove, it turns out we are naked. We have no more, or we have a few weapons. We have a neighbor that is militarily mighty at the moment, and the US could just potentially drop us. So we are quite vulnerable at the moment.
Well, I think there is a possibility. I believe it's a small possibility that if Trump is elected, that he could put an end to NATO, or he could weaken it to the point where it just didn't matter. I think that possibility exists. And I think the Europeans would be in trouble, not so much because of the Russian threat. Again, I think the idea that the Netherlands faces this great Russian threat is simply not true. The real problem that Europe faces in a world where NATO disappears is that the European states would have to provide for their own security, and they would compete with each other. The Germans and the French, the Germans and the Poles, that's what would happen. The Netherlands would think differently about Germany in a world where there's no NATO. The reason that the Netherlands is very happy about NATO's existence and does not want NATO to go away, and this is the reason that people in the Netherlands and people in Europe more generally fear Trump so much, is that they understand that NATO and the American military presence or the American pacifier in Europe takes security competition among European countries off the table. So that's the real threat here. I don't think there's a threat of Russia dominating Europe.